You walk down a hospital hallway in the quiet of early morning. The lights hum above you, sterile white bouncing off tiled walls. It feels safe here, doesn't it? A place of healing, where surgeons save lives, where parents breathe sighs of relief as their children recover. But hidden within these very corridors, a whisper begins to travel. A whisper about a man in a crisp white coat, a surgeon respected for his skills, his calm hands, his authority. That whisper grows heavier with each passing year, carrying a weight that France itself will one day struggle to bear. This is not just a story of a single doctor. It becomes France's largest abuse trial, one that rattles the foundations of trust in medicine, institutions, and silence itself. Welcome to 102 Hours, where your late-night companion guides you through true crime and historical mysteries in soft, deliberate tones. Tonight, you join me on a journey into the shadows of the operating room, where healing hands turned predatory, and where justice arrived decades too late. Before we wander further, let me gently remind you, if you find comfort in these midnight explorations, consider liking and subscribing, and let me know in the comments where in the world and at what hour you are listening. It always fascinates me to know which city lights or quiet villages are sharing this moment with us. Now, draw your blanket close, let your breath slow, and step softly with me into the story of the surgeon and the scandal. France's biggest abuse trial. The man at the center of this scandal is Joël Le Scouarnec, a name once ordinary in medical directories, now infamous in the darkest corners of European justice. Born in Brittany, France in 1950, Le Scouarnec built the kind of career any aspiring doctor might envy. For more than 2 decades, he wore the uniform of trust, surgical scrubs, a confident posture, and the calm aura of a healer. Patients called him reassuring, colleagues saw him as competent, and institutions kept him moving through hospitals without question. Yet behind that carefully tended mask, he harbored compulsions so vile they would later lead to charges involving nearly 300 victims. The first whispers did not start in 2017, when a young neighbor bravely spoke out, nor in 2020, when he was first convicted. They began much earlier. Quiet complaints, odd discoveries, moments when alarm bells should have rung louder but instead dissolved into paperwork. In 2005, for example, Le Scouarnec was caught with child sexual abuse imagery on his computer. He admitted it. The punishment? A suspended sentence. No prison, no removal from medicine, no lasting restrictions. He continued practicing surgery, still in white coats, still behind closed doors with patients, still trusted. Imagine the sense of impunity that must have nurtured. Investigators still question whether stronger action back then could have saved hundreds from suffering. History has seen similar failures before. Think of the 19th century London hospitals, where physicians operated without gloves, not yet believing in germ theory. The blind spot was scientific then. In Le Scouarnec's case, it was institutional. Just as London's medical establishment ignored hand-washing, French institutions ignored red flags. Both oversights carried devastating consequences. But beyond the official records, there are fringe details that feel chilling in hindsight. Some neighbors described him as eccentric, even odd, quietly tending to his garden or obsessively repairing small household items. Nothing overtly sinister, just slightly off. Years later, those quirks would be reframed not as harmless idiosyncrasies but as glimpses into a man whose inner life was deeply fractured. His journals, discovered during searches, contained drawings and written accounts that read more like confessions than fantasies. Pages upon pages where he described what he had done to children, often with cold precision, as though documenting surgical procedures. Those journals turned whispers into screams. When investigators opened them, they faced the horrific realization that the abuse was not a handful of isolated incidents. It was systemic, spanning decades, cities, and nearly 300 victims. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a reckoning. The whispers that once floated down Brittany S. hospital corridors had grown into a storm loud enough to shake all of France. And yet, you have to wonder, how many other whispers are still traveling through the hallways of institutions we trust? How many doors remain closed, their secrets unspoken? The case of Joël Le Scouarnec forces France, and perhaps you too, to confront the uneasy truth that even in the safest spaces, shadows can lurk just out of sight. So here in the quiet of your own room, as the hum of your lamp fills the silence, you're left holding a question that haunts investigators, victims, and citizens alike. Why did it take so long for whispers to become words loud enough to be heard? You picture him now. Joël Le Scouarnec, a man who moved through French hospitals with the quiet authority of a seasoned surgeon. His surgical gowns always crisp, his demeanor always calm. In the eyes of colleagues, he was the kind of doctor who gave reassurance just by walking into the room. Patients, especially parents of children, clung to his presence as if skill alone could promise healing. But masks, as history reminds us, served not only to protect but to conceal. And the mask he wore, this trusted professional persona, hid a darkness so profound that when it finally cracked, the fragments exposed decades of betrayal. France has a long tradition of revering its medical elite. Think of the celebrated surgeon Ambroise Paré in the 16th century, who pioneered battlefield medicine, or René Leriche in the 20th, who wrote of surgery as both science and art. Le Scouarnec slid easily into this lineage, benefiting from the respect society grants anyone who wields scalpel and sutures. His resume gleamed: decades of practice, operating rooms across Brittany, and the quiet reverence reserved for those who can steady trembling hands under fluorescent lights. But unlike Paré or Leriche, his legacy will never be one of healing. It will forever be a synonym for violation. Investigators still question whether his medical authority itself enabled his crimes. As a surgeon, he worked in intimate spaces, with anesthesia providing both the cover and the silence he needed. Imagine the twisted irony. Where others saw a patient sleeping peacefully under his care, he saw opportunity. And yet, outside of the operating theater, his life appeared ordinary. He lived in rural France, maintained a garden, exchanged small talk with neighbors. He even married and raised children of his own. The performance of normalcy was complete, an actor who never broke character. Here's the quirky, almost unsettling detail. He was known for his fascination with small mechanical repairs. Old clocks, household gadgets, toys. He tinkered with them endlessly. Friends thought it charming. A surgeon's hands keeping busy outside of work. But when his private diaries were uncovered, investigators noticed he described some of his abuses with the same technical precision he used to describe fixing objects. To him, people were not patients or neighbors. They were parts of a broken machine he alone manipulated. That chilling reduction of humanity into mechanics may explain how he compartmentalized his life for so long. What's striking is how resilient the mask remained. Even after his 2005 conviction for possessing child sexual abuse images, he retained professional standing. A suspended sentence barely dented his reputation. Colleagues whispered, but no decisive action was taken. Hospitals shuffled him around rather than confront him. In a different world, perhaps, the mask would have cracked there and then. But France, like many countries, has long been reluctant to publicly shame professionals unless absolutely forced. Reputation was preserved, but at a terrible cost. History gives us echoes of this blindness. Consider the case of Harold Shipman in the United Kingdom. The trusted general practitioner later revealed to be one of history's most prolific serial killers. For years, his respectability shielded him. In Le Scouarnec's case, it wasn't murder, but abuse. Yet the mechanism was the same. Trust and authority forming an almost impenetrable shield. And yet the man was not invincible. The mask began to slip in the late 2010s. Not because of institutional bravery, but because a child, just 8 years old, spoke up. This young neighbor's courage pierced a silence that decades of bureaucracy had failed to break. Without that voice, he might still have been sitting quietly in his garden, respected surgeon by day, predator by night. It is unsettling to imagine how many times he looked into the eyes of worried parents and said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of your child." He said it with confidence, with a surgeon's authority, and most believed him. Why wouldn't they? Hospitals are sanctuaries of healing. To doubt him would have meant doubting the very system designed to protect. The mask, then, was not just his creation. It was co-authored by institutions, by silence, by the cultural weight of medical authority. When it finally came off in court, the image underneath horrified a nation. Yet perhaps the deeper horror is realizing how many saw the mask, suspected cracks, and still looked away. And so, as you settle deeper into the quiet of your own space, you carry that image. A man in a white coat, fixing clocks by day, performing surgeries by night, and writing his true self into diaries only investigators would one day read. A mask can only hold so long, but the longer it holds, the greater the devastation when it falls. You imagine the sound of a faint alarm bell. Not the shrill ring that jolts you from sleep, but a softer one, barely audible, easily dismissed. That was the sound of the first warnings in the story of Joël Le Scouarnec, France's scandalous surgeon. The alarms came not in 2017, when a neighbor's child finally spoke out, but more than a decade earlier. They rang in offices filled with case files, in whispered staffroom conversations, in police reports that never gathered dust for long before being quietly shelved. And each time, the system rolled over, hit snooze, and went back to sleep. The year was 2005. Le Scouarnec was already in his mid-50s, well established in his surgical career. Police caught him with a collection of child sexual abuse images on his computer. It was enough for a conviction. That should have been the breaking point, the moment when institutions stepped in to sever him from medical practice. Instead, he received a suspended sentence. No prison, no removal from the hospital system. He was allowed to keep working as if nothing had happened. One magistrate at the time described the offense as serious but isolated, words that would later sound almost surreal given what was to come. Investigators still question whether that leniency wasn't just a misstep, but a catastrophic failure. This is where history offers a bitter lesson. In the 18th century, France endured what became known as the Affair of the Diamond Necklace, a scandal that shook public trust in the monarchy. At its core, it wasn't the necklace itself but the blindness of authority. Royalty dismissing warning signs, believing what they wanted to believe. That stoked outrage. In a way, Le Scouarnec's story mirrors that blindness. Authorities saw the images, the evidence, but preferred the comforting narrative. A respected surgeon making a one-time mistake. Among colleagues, whispers began to surface. Some noticed his odd behaviors, taking special interest in children beyond medical necessity, or spending unusual amounts of time near vulnerable patients. Nurses here and there raised eyebrows. But hospitals, like many institutions, are built on hierarchy. Questioning a senior surgeon felt almost unthinkable. A nurse who once reported feeling uncomfortable with his presence near young patients later said her concerns were brushed aside as exaggeration. To challenge a surgeon was to challenge the system itself. And here's a fringe detail. Despite the 2005 conviction, Le Scouarnec kept his professional insurance. That bureaucratic stamp allowed him to continue operating, literally and figuratively. In France, losing insurance usually means the end of a medical career. But in his case, administrators either overlooked or excused the risk. It was an invisible endorsement, one that silently told him, "Your mask still holds. Your authority remains intact." What investigators later pieced together is staggering. Some of his abuses happened after surgeries, when patients were under anesthesia, utterly defenseless. Others occurred in more personal settings, including within his own family circle. Yet through it all, the alarms remained whispers, not sirens. Local police, medical boards, and even courts had all glimpsed fragments of the truth but never assembled the full picture. You can almost imagine the frustration of prosecutors years later, sifting through these old files. Each paper, each note, each isolated incident was another missed chance to intervene. Investigators still question whether stronger action after the 2005 case could have prevented the near 300 victims who would later emerge. That haunting number now hangs over every decision not made, every alarm ignored. And this is where the human mind struggles. How could a system designed to protect allow harm on this scale? The answer lies partly in psychology, our tendency to defer to authority figures, to assume the best when evidence is uncomfortable. It lies partly in bureaucracy, where paperwork moves slower than the speed of harm. And it lies partly in fear of scandal, fear of admitting that the guardian of life in the operating theater could also be a predator. The case reminds us that institutions, like people, can fall prey to denial. And denial, when left unchecked, can be devastating. Just as the Titanic kept sailing despite iceberg warnings, the French medical system allowed Le Scouarnec to keep practicing, despite the alarms. Both believed in their invincibility. Both ended in tragedy. So, tonight, as you listen in the calm of your own room, you might feel the unease of that faint alarm in your ears. A reminder that the first warning is often the most important, even if it's the easiest to ignore. Imagine walking into a quiet study, blinds half drawn, the smell of dust and ink heavy in the air. On a desk sits a stack of notebooks worn at the edges, their spines cracked from years of handling. At first glance, they look ordinary, like the journals of any meticulous professional who keeps track of surgical notes, patient lists, perhaps even grocery reminders. But when investigators opened Joël Le Scouarnec's private diaries, they weren't met with shopping lists or recipes. They found confessions. Not whispered to a priest, not hidden in anonymous letters, but written in his own hand, page after page like a ledger of darkness. The diaries were discovered during searches of his home, after suspicions finally tipped into formal investigation. What they contained horrified even seasoned investigators. There were descriptions of encounters with children, drawings that echoed his written words, and a tone disturbingly clinical, as though he were writing case reports rather than chronicling crimes. Victims were anonymized by initials, yet details matched real people, sometimes patients, sometimes family, sometimes complete strangers. Reading them was less like entering a fantasy world and more like auditing a grotesque record book. Investigators still question whether these notebooks were meant as trophies or simply a twisted form of self-documentation. One criminologist compared them to the journals of historical offenders who could not resist leaving a trace, like Jack the Ripper's alleged scrapbook or the coded diaries of child abuser Marc Dutroux in Belgium. These writings aren't just memories. They're an attempt to control the narrative, even if only for oneself. What's especially unsettling is the precision. A surgeon's hand is steady by training, and his words reflected that discipline. He wrote without haste, methodical, almost detached. He recorded the way some men track their workouts or catalog their wine collections. To investigators, this detachment revealed something chilling. A man who did not see children as people, but as specimens, moments to be classified and filed away. And here's a strange, almost fringe detail. Between passages of abuse, he sometimes scribbled ordinary notes. A reminder to prune a tree in the garden, a line about fixing a broken toy, even sketches of surgical techniques. It created a surreal juxtaposition, mundane domestic life beside unimaginable harm. The notebooks weren't hidden in some locked vault. They were simply there among his possessions, as if part of the furniture of his mind. The impact of these discoveries went far beyond the courtroom. They became symbolic. In France, journalists described the diaries as the Black Archive. a kind of secret history of a surgeon who had long lived a double life. For survivors and their families, the writings weren't just evidence. They were a cruel validation. Proof on paper that what they had endured wasn't imagined, wasn't exaggerated, but was systematically recorded by the man himself. History gives us echoes again. In the 1940s, psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron kept meticulous notes of his controversial MK-Ultra experiments in Canada, writing down details as though they were routine science. Decades later, those notebooks became damning evidence of ethical collapse. The same is true here. Paper that was never meant for public eyes turned into an indictment more powerful than witness testimony. And yet, reading those words took a toll on everyone involved. Investigators who pored over them spoke of the psychological weight, the way the ink seemed to press on their own sanity. Some described nightmares, others an almost physical nausea. It is one thing to know crimes have occurred. It is another to read them in the handwriting of the perpetrator, in a voice both banal and monstrous. The journals also left one haunting uncertainty. Not every entry corresponded clearly to a known victim. Some initials, some vague descriptions, did not match anyone who has come forward or been identified. Investigators still question whether those writings describe real but unknown victims, or whether parts of the diaries drift into fantasy. That question may never be fully answered, leaving families to wonder whether their children too were hidden in those pages. So picture that study again. The desk, the notebooks, the blinds drawn against the outside world. Each page was a whisper turned into ink, a secret too dark to remain hidden forever. And when the courtroom finally opened them, France found itself staring at the surgeon's truest face. Not the healer in white, but the archivist of his own crimes. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a hospital room. White walls, the steady beep of a monitor, the rustle of sheets. For most of us, it's a place of vulnerability, where we hand our bodies over to strangers in scrubs and trust they'll protect us. But for the children who crossed paths with Joël Le Scouarnec, that vulnerability became the stage for silence. Their voices, tiny, trembling, anesthetized, or dismissed, rarely pierced the walls of authority that surrounded him. Some were patients, drifting into unconsciousness as anesthesia took hold. They never had the chance to cry out. Others were relatives, children visiting family, too young to name what had happened to them or too afraid to try. And still others were neighbors, lured by the supposed kindness of the doctor next door. Across decades, the pattern repeated. Opportunities for resistance stripped away by age, by fear, or by power. Survivors would later describe how impossible it was to tell anyone, how the very idea of accusing a surgeon, a man trusted with saving lives, felt unthinkable. History has seen this pattern before. In 19th century France, child laborers filled factories, their complaints rarely heard. Abuse and exploitation thrived not because children were invisible, but because society chose not to listen. The parallel is bitter. Centuries later, children in Brittany still struggled to be believed when power and profit were on the other side of the scale. And here's one of those unsettling fringe details. When the investigation finally began, police uncovered drawings among his possessions. Some were crude sketches of children, others disturbing cartoons. But between those, oddly enough, were innocent doodles. Flowers, animals, even notes of nursery rhymes. It was as if the line between childhood and predation blurred in his mind, leaving behind artifacts that were half sinister, half surreal. Many victims lived with unspoken pain for years, sometimes decades. Some described stomach aches that never went away, or anxiety that surfaced in adulthood without knowing why. Only when Le Scouarnec's case exploded into national headlines did they begin to connect the fragments. One survivor, now an adult, said she recognized herself in the court documents, her initials appearing in his diaries like a ghost from childhood. Imagine the shock, discovering your own abuse not from memory, but from the perpetrator's casual record-keeping. investigators still question whether silence was reinforced by the system as much as by fear. Teachers sometimes suspected. Parents occasionally noticed a change in their child's behavior. But without clear words, without the strength to accuse someone so powerful, the concerns drifted away. Victims were left voiceless not only because of their age, but because institutions demanded evidence louder than whispers. When the first testimonies were finally read aloud in court, the silence broke like glass. Some survivors wept. Others sat stiffly, unwilling to let him see their pain. Judges, journalists, even defense attorneys described the atmosphere as unbearable. Hundreds of stories, different in detail but bound by the same chilling thread. Each voice echoed the others, forming a collective cry that had been suppressed for far too long. And yet the echoes linger. Some survivors never came forward, perhaps never will. Their silence is its own testimony, an absence carved into the trial record. Just as ancient ruins tell stories without words, the missing voices in this case remind us that what was uncovered is only part of the whole. So, as you sit here tonight, with the quiet hum of your own room, you can almost hear the silence of those children. It is heavier than screams, more enduring than words. In the story of France's biggest abuse trial, the greatest tragedy is not only what was done, but how long the victims were kept voiceless in the very places meant to protect them. Picture a smaller courtroom in Western France, fluorescent lights buzzing, wooden benches creaking as people shuffle in. It's the year 2020, and Joël Le Scouarnec, once a surgeon of local prestige, now sits as a defendant. This first trial isn't yet the colossal scandal that will later shake the nation, but it is the crack in the dam. 4 children are at the center of it. 4 young lives brave enough or perhaps unlucky enough to be thrust into the spotlight. Their testimonies, their pain, become the first official acknowledgement of what many had long whispered. The charges then were narrower. The rape and sexual assault of 3 minors, including his own nieces, plus the abuse of an 8-year-old patient. For the first time, he could not hide behind his mask of professionalism. In 2020, the court sentenced him to 15 years in prison, a punishment that finally removed him from the operating room. But even as the gavel fell, the case already carried the seeds of something larger. Investigators had glimpsed his diaries, heard fragments of testimony from potential additional victims, and realized this story stretched far beyond 4 children. Think of it like a prelude, the opening act in a tragedy already written. France has seen this rhythm before, a small scandal revealing the outlines of a much larger catastrophe. In the 1890s, the Dreyfus affair began with one man's conviction for treason, but soon expanded into a national reckoning with anti-Semitism and injustice. Likewise, Le Scouarnec's first conviction was not the end, but the beginning, a spark that illuminated decades of hidden abuse. And here's an odd, almost fringe detail. During that 2020 trial, journalists noted how subdued he appeared. No fiery denials, no outbursts. He admitted much of the behavior, often in flat, clinical tones. Some observers compared him to a surgeon describing a failed procedure, detached, even weary. It was unsettling, not because he was defensive, but because he wasn't. He seemed almost resigned, as though the trial were a formality rather than a reckoning. For survivors, though, it was monumental. At last, someone in authority was saying, "We believe you." Those 4 testimonies became the cornerstone on which hundreds more would eventually rest. Families who had doubted their children began to reconsider. Former patients who had buried their memories felt emboldened to speak. The 2020 trial cracked open a vault of silence, and the air that rushed out carried the stench of decades. Investigators still question whether the 15-year sentence truly reflected the scale of harm even then apparent. With diaries in evidence and whispers of more victims already surfacing, some argued he should have faced broader charges at once. But the French justice system, cautious and procedural, chose to handle the cases in phases. In hindsight, that caution seems almost quaint given the avalanche of accusations that followed. But here is where history's irony strikes hardest. If the 2005 conviction for illegal images had been the alarm, and the 2020 conviction the crack in the dam, then the Great Flood was only just beginning. This smaller trial, though limited in scope, was the hinge moment. The proof that he could be held accountable, the public spark that gave hundreds of silent survivors the courage to finally step into the light. So you sit here now, in the dim glow of your own space, and feel the tension of that prelude. 4 children in a courtroom, their voices steady or trembling, yet powerful enough to open the door to France's biggest abuse trial. They were not the whole story, but without them, the rest might never have been told. Be it 2023, the story had grown too large to contain within the walls of any single courtroom. What began with 4 children had swelled into the largest abuse trial in modern French history. The numbers were staggering. 312 potential victims, stretching across decades, with 349 separate charges stacked against Joël Le Scouarnec. The sheer weight of testimony transformed the trial into something more than a legal proceeding. It became a national mirror, forcing France to confront questions it had long avoided. Imagine the courtroom then. Rows of lawyers, journalists filling every available seat, survivors sitting side by side with their families. Some clutched tissues, others notebooks, still others nothing at all. Hands bare, folded tight, as if to hold themselves together. Judges presided, but the atmosphere was more like a reckoning than a trial. Day after day, the court heard fragments of horror, each story different yet stitched together by the same terrible thread. Trust betrayed by a man in white. And the diaries. Those infamous notebooks became the backbone of the prosecution, a grotesque catalog of names, ages, and acts. Investigators believed they mapped nearly an entire lifetime of abuse, sometimes with chilling precision. At times, though, the line blurred between fact and fantasy. Some entries were impossible to verify, and defense attorneys pounced on those gaps, arguing that exaggerations or delusions had been mixed into the record. But for the survivors who recognized themselves, there was no ambiguity. The pages carried the truth of their childhoods in ink that could not be erased. France has seen other moments where hidden wrongs erupted into the open. In the early 2000s, the Catholic Church scandals exposed decades of clerical abuse. In 2011, the Dominique Strauss-Kahn case ignited global debate over power, sex, and credibility. Each of these shattered the illusion that institutions always protect the vulnerable. Le Scouarnec's trial stood in that lineage, but larger, darker, because it spanned not one institution, but several. Hospitals, families, neighborhoods, even the justice system itself. And then there's the unsettling fringe detail. Police discovered that Le Scouarnec sometimes disguised his writing in anatomical shorthand, as if describing medical procedures. Abuse recorded in the same language he once used in operating rooms. To some, it was proof of his fractured psyche, unable or unwilling to separate surgery from predation. To others, it was a chilling reflection of how he hid his crimes in plain sight, cloaking them in the very vocabulary of healing. For survivors, the trial was both liberation and agony. Some finally told their stories aloud for the first time, breaking decades of silence. Others chose not to appear, letting lawyers read their testimonies instead. In court, there were moments of unbearable tension. One survivor reportedly stared directly at him as her words were read, refusing to look away. Another could not bear the sight, turning her chair to face the wall. The scale of the case forced French society to reckon with a devastating truth. Institutions had failed. Hospitals that ignored complaints, courts that minimized earlier convictions, a culture that too often prized professional reputation over children's safety. Commentators began calling it a French Savile moment, echoing the United Kingdom's reckoning with the crimes of Jimmy Savile, the entertainer who abused hundreds under the guise of celebrity. But unlike a distant scandal, This was unfolding in real time, with real children now grown, sitting just a few feet away from the man who had scarred them. And the country watched, not as distant spectators but as uneasy participants. Because if Le Scouarnec could hide in plain sight for so long, then the problem was not only him, it was the silence that allowed him to thrive. So tonight, as you lean closer into this story, you feel the weight of those courtrooms, the shuffle of papers, the hum of microphones, the broken voices echoing through vaulted chambers. France was not only putting one man on trial, it was putting itself there too, under the harsh lights of accountability, forced to confront the shadows it had allowed to grow for far too long. Picture the courthouse in Saintes, western France, on the morning the proceedings truly began. The air felt heavy, as though even the building itself strained under the weight of so many lives, so many stories waiting to be spoken aloud. You slip into the gallery, careful with every footstep, and notice how silence dominates before each session. It's not a peaceful quiet, no, it's the hush of anticipation, like a storm about to break. On one side sits Joël Le Scouarnec, the surgeon at the heart of France's biggest abuse trial. His posture is slouched, his hair thinned to wisps, his face pale under fluorescent light. For a man once trusted with scalpels and human hearts, he now cuts a diminished figure, dressed plainly, no longer the respected physician, but a prisoner awaiting judgment. The defense describes him as frail, remorseful even, but the survivor's gaze does not soften. To them, frailty cannot erase decades of damage. Across from him, rows of survivors fill the benches. Some are middle-aged now, some elderly, their childhoods long behind them yet still painfully present. Others are younger, navigating adulthood with scars that never healed. They lean close to their lawyers, adjusting papers or gripping hands for courage. When their names are called, they stand, or sometimes cannot, and let words tremble out. The testimonies form a rhythm, each voice different, each story uniquely devastating, yet threaded with haunting similarities. The doctor's authority, the sterile hospital rooms, the anesthetized helplessness. One woman recalls the strange smell of disinfectant lingering in her hair after appointments, an odor that years later would still trigger nausea. Another man describes waking during surgery, seeing the surgeon's face far too close, a memory blurred yet undeniable. Observers notice how Le Scouarnec reacts. Sometimes his gaze drops to the floor. At other moments he stares almost defiantly, lips pressed tight, as if daring the court to prove him guilty beyond what he already admitted. Lawyers say he confessed to many acts, but denied others, insisting his diaries contained fantasies alongside reality. The blurred line between fact and fiction becomes one of the trial's central arguments, leaving jurors, and you, listening, wrestling with what to believe. Historical echoes thread through the proceedings. You recall how in 1894, the Dreyfus affair shook France, not for abuse but for the way justice itself seemed compromised. Then too, a courtroom became a stage where the nation's conscience was on trial. Here in Saintes, more than a century later, a new reckoning unfolds. Not about treason, but about trust. When the accused is a surgeon, a figure meant to heal, the betrayal pierces deeper than most crimes. And then there are the fringe details, almost surreal in their intrusion. One day, the courtroom halts briefly because of a fire alarm. False, thankfully, but for survivors, the blaring siren feels jarringly familiar, echoing the alarms that once sounded in hospital corridors. Another day, a bird flutters through an open window, startling the judge mid-sentence, as if nature itself resists the stifling weight of the testimony. These moments of odd interruption only highlight the grinding seriousness of everything else. Still, questions remain. Investigators still question whether every alleged act in the diaries corresponds to a real victim, or whether some were the surgeon's twisted imaginings. For survivors, though, the distinction matters little. What matters is that he had the power to write such things at all. power rooted in a system that trusted him blindly for decades. As the trial stretches into long days, the atmosphere in the gallery shifts. At first, reporters whisper furiously, pens scratching in shorthand. By the second week, exhaustion settles in. Survivors sip water slowly, eyes red, yet keep showing up as though presence itself is resistance. Judges, too, appear weary, their black robes heavy with responsibility. But the rhythm holds. Accusation, defense, testimony, silence. Again and again, like waves crashing against stone. From your seat, you sense that the trial is not just about facts. It is performance, ritual, reckoning. Each survivor who stands is part of a larger chorus, one that refuses to be silenced again. And as their words fill the hall, you understand that the court is no longer simply a place of law. It has become a cathedral of truth-telling, however painful, however imperfect, where the echoes of broken childhoods finally rise to the rafters. The day of sentencing arrives with a strange stillness. Reporters gather outside the courthouse, their microphones lined up like sentinels. Survivors clutch folders, tissues, or nothing at all, waiting for the words that will try to measure the immeasurable. Inside, the judges file in, robes swaying, the air thick with anticipation. This is the moment when years of horror, investigation, and testimony condense into a single number. The length of Joël Le Scouarnec's prison term. When the judgment is read, the words fall heavy but somehow hollow. 20 years in prison, lifetime registration as a sex offender, permanent ban from working with children. The gavel comes down, but instead of release, many feel only frustration. Because for survivors who lost their childhoods, 20 years sounds small, a fraction of what was stolen. Some shake their heads. Others cry silently. A few leave the room before the session ends, unable to hear applause from those who see justice as done. You lean back in your seat and absorb the paradox. Here is a man convicted of crimes against children on a scale France has rarely seen. His acts spanned decades, his diary suggested hundreds of victims, yet the law's arithmetic boiled it down to 2 decades behind bars. To some, the sentence is firm, even groundbreaking. Rarely has a French doctor faced such accountability. To others, it is infuriatingly light, a reminder that the law can never truly balance suffering. The defense tries to frame the punishment as severe, pointing out his age. Le Scouarnec, born in 1950, will likely die in prison. For them, that fact alone proves justice, but survivors think differently. "He stole my childhood," one says softly outside the courthouse, and he will still have time to reflect in his. The wound does not heal because the calendar pages flip. France has a history of grappling with punishments that feel out of sync with public outrage. Back in 1981, the abolition of the death penalty sparked fierce debate about whether the state could ever deliver proportionate justice. Now, in 2023, the Le Scouarnec case revives those questions in a new form. How do you punish someone for hundreds of alleged crimes when the law only allows for a handful of convictions? In the courtroom, a fringe moment crystallizes the tension. Right after sentencing, one lawyer accidentally drops a heavy binder on the floor, the echo startling everyone. Survivors flinch as if struck by the sound. For a second, all eyes shift away from the judges and toward that fallen binder, a reminder that the weight of this case will keep dropping unexpectedly into lives long after the trial is over. Investigators still question whether the diaries, dense and grotesque, captured the full truth of his crimes or blurred fact with dark fantasy. That uncertainty lingers like smoke even after the sentence is delivered. For the legal system, the evidence supported what could be proven. For survivors, the diaries remain an endless accusation, one that will never be fully answered. And so the gavel closes this chapter, but you feel no true closure. The sentence is a number. The pain is infinite. Outside, television crews broadcast reactions across France. Politicians issue statements. Editorials debate reform. But survivors, real people with real scars, carry the verdict differently. For them, the trial was never about years, but about finally being heard. As night falls on the courthouse, you imagine the cells where Le Scouarnec will spend the rest of his life. Bars, gray walls, silence. To some, that's justice. To others, it's a pale shadow of what should have been. And for you, listening in the hush of this retelling, the question lingers still. Can any sentence ever weigh the same as a stolen childhood? When the dust of sentencing settled, the spotlight shifted. True, the surgeon was behind bars, but now the country turned its gaze on the scaffolding that allowed him to operate undisturbed for decades. Hospitals, medical boards, and even local authorities suddenly found themselves under the same harsh glare that once illuminated the defendant's chair. Because if one man could harm so many, the question was clear: who looked away and why? In Brittany, whispers spread through hospital corridors. Former colleagues recalled odd moments: doors locked too long, whispers from nurses who dared not push too far. Yet complaints, if ever voiced, seemed to evaporate before reaching administrators' ears. Investigations later revealed that Le Scouarnec had already been convicted in 2005 for possessing child pornography, but this barely dented his career. Instead of dismissal, he received a quiet reprimand and carried on operating. That detail shocked the public as much as the crimes themselves. France has long prided itself on a robust medical system, but this case cracked its reputation. Parliamentary debates thundered with accusations of systemic negligence. How could hospitals employ a man with such a record? Why were background checks flimsy? The scandal forced officials to admit what few wanted to hear. Trust in authority had bred complacency. Think back further in history. 1957, when the French health system introduced universal coverage, hailed as revolutionary. That milestone was about protection, about dignity and care. Yet here, decades later, the same system failed to protect its most vulnerable patients. The contrast was stark. A system built to heal had been twisted into a shield for a predator. Quirky, even surreal, anecdotes emerged. One retired nurse recalled how Le Scouarnec kept children's drawings pinned in his office, insisting they brightened the sterile space. At the time, no one thought twice. Now, those innocent sketches felt sinister in hindsight, relics of a trust grotesquely exploited. Another colleague remembered his odd habit of humming nursery rhymes while scrubbing for surgery. Quirks once dismissed as eccentric, now recast as chilling. Investigators still question whether professional loyalty, doctors protecting their own, played a role in silencing concerns. Was it denial, fear of scandal, or a culture that valued reputation above all else? Perhaps it was all three, intertwined in the fabric of French institutions where challenging hierarchy was nearly unthinkable. Families, too, questioned the courts. After his 2005 conviction, why was Le Scouarnec not placed under stricter surveillance? Why no registry alert for the communities where he lived and worked? These questions weren't just legal. They were moral indictments, reminders that bureaucracy can wound as deeply as any scalpel. By 2023, calls for reform grew louder. Politicians proposed stricter checks for medical professionals, mandatory reporting rules for suspicious behavior, and better protections for whistleblowers. Survivor groups demanded apologies from hospitals that once shielded him through silence. Some administrators complied, issuing public statements of regret. Others stayed quiet, hoping the storm would pass. But survivors would not let it pass. For you, sitting in the dim quiet of this retelling, the system feels almost like a second perpetrator. Not with hands, but with indifference. Not with acts, but with omissions. Because silence, when stretched over decades, becomes its own kind of violence. And so the trial of Joël Le Scouarnec ended. But the trial of France's institutions had only begun. The question now was not whether one surgeon was guilty, but whether a nation could learn from the shadows it had allowed to thrive unchecked. When the verdict made headlines, its reverberations did not stop at France's borders. Across Europe, editors splashed the story of Joël Le Scouarnec across front pages. The surgeon who betrayed his patients. For many, the name instantly evoked unease. It wasn't just a French scandal, it was a European alarm bell. In Germany, commentators recalled their own reckonings with abuse in institutional settings, particularly within the Catholic Church, where inquiries uncovered thousands of victims silenced for decades. In Ireland, echoes sounded even louder. Survivors of the Magdalene laundries and church-run orphanages drew chilling parallels. Trusted authority figures, cloistered institutions, silent oversight. The common thread was not nationality, but vulnerability. The way children everywhere could be dismissed, forgotten, or sacrificed to protect reputations. The United Kingdom, too, felt the resonance. The name Jimmy Savile hovered in the air, Britain's own cautionary tale of unchecked predation. Both cases carried unsettling similarities: decades of abuse, whispers ignored, systems that prized prestige over protection. The Le Scouarnec trial became shorthand in British tabloids for the French Savile, a moniker survivors in France both embraced for its spotlight and resented for the way it risked trivializing unique personal suffering. History offered its comparisons. In 1996, Belgium convulsed with outrage during the Marc Dutroux scandal, where systemic failures in policing allowed a predator to kidnap and abuse young girls. That case led to massive reforms and a white march, when hundreds of thousands filled Brussels in silent protest. France now faced its own parallel moment, though quieter, filtered through parliamentary hearings and survivor networks rather than the streets. And then came the fringe anecdotes, almost bizarre against such weight. In Italy, a satirical newspaper ran a cartoon of a surgeon holding both a scalpel and a diary, a dark jab at how one man could embody healing and horror at once. Survivor groups condemned it, yet it sparked debate about whether satire helps confront trauma or merely exploits it. Meanwhile, in Spain, a grassroots association of patients demanded random psychological screenings for doctors, citing Le Scouarnec as proof that professional skill cannot be trusted without accountability. Investigators still question whether similar predators remain hidden in plain sight, shielded by institutions too eager to protect their own. That uncertainty keeps the scandal alive, a reminder that trust in doctors, priests, teachers, or any authority must never be blind. The European Parliament even debated whether cross-border registries should flag healthcare professionals convicted of sexual crimes, preventing them from moving silently from one country to another. For survivors, this was proof their pain might spark protections for future generations, even beyond France. For others, it felt too late, too small, like a lock added after the house had already been looted. As you sit with this story tonight, you sense that the echoes across Europe are not just about law or policy. They are about memory, about ensuring names like Dutroux, Savile, and now Le Scouarnec are not allowed to fade into history's dustbin, but remain as warning signs along the path societies must walk. Because silence is never only local, it is contagious, and the only cure, however imperfect, is light. When the courtroom lights dimmed and the journalists packed away their microphones, life did not return to normal. It couldn't. For the survivors of Joël Le Scouarnec, there was no clean ending, no cinematic fade-out. There was only the slow, uneven work of trying to live after decades of silence had finally been broken. Some described a bittersweet relief, finally heard, finally believed. Others admitted the trial reopened wounds they had spent years trying to bury. In small towns across Brittany, whispers still circulate. Families wonder aloud how they could have missed the signs. Neighbors speak in hushed tones about the doctor they once invited to Sunday dinners. For many, the scandal left a permanent stain on memory, proof that even the familiar can conceal the monstrous. Parents now look at hospitals with a sharper edge of caution, their trust shaken in ways hard to repair, Nationally, the reckoning runs deeper. Survivor groups continue pressing for reforms. Mandatory background checks, stricter reporting obligations, survivor-led commissions to review historic complaints. Some progress has been made, but change moves slower than outrage. Bureaucracy rarely runs on the urgency of trauma, yet the voices of survivors remain persistent, refusing to let institutions retreat back into comfortable denial. Historical shadows stretch long here. In 1977, France passed its first major child protection law, hailed as a step forward for vulnerable youth. Decades later, the Le Scouarnec case revealed just how fragile those protections remained when institutions chose reputation over responsibility. History doesn't just repeat. It lingers, reminding each new generation what complacency costs. Quirky, almost surreal details keep surfacing in the aftermath. A former colleague revealed that the surgeon kept a collection of miniature surgical tools displayed on his desk, once seen as a charming quirk, now a symbol of obsession twisted into something far darker. Survivors spoke of how even mundane objects, like the hum of fluorescent lights or the smell of disinfectant, could still yank them back into memories they wished they could forget. Investigators still question whether all victims have come forward. The diaries name hundreds, but many entries remain uncorroborated. Some alleged victims may never step into the light, either because memories blur with time or because shame and fear continue to silence them. The unanswered pages hang like ghosts at the edge of the story, reminders of how much will remain forever unknowable. For the rest of France, the scandal sits as both wound and warning. Schools now host workshops on spotting grooming behaviors. Medical associations revisit their codes of ethics. And in whispered conversations at night, parents remind their children, if something feels wrong, speak and keep speaking until someone listens. And you, here in the quiet of this retelling, feel the lingering heaviness too, because the reckoning isn't only about one surgeon, it's about a society learning, again, that silence is never neutral. Silence is permission, and the only way forward is through vigilance, compassion, and the courage to listen when the whispers start. So now, with the story fully told, let your breath slow. You've traveled from hospital corridors in Brittany to courtrooms filled with broken voices, and finally into the uneasy stillness of aftermath. The scandal of Joël Le Scouarnec, France's biggest abuse trial, shows us that justice can punish one man but cannot erase decades of pain. It shows us that trust in systems is fragile, and that silence, however comfortable, always carries a cost. And yet there is resilience here too. Survivors who spoke aloud after years of silence. Families who keep demanding reforms. A society learning, slowly but surely, that vigilance must live where blind trust once reigned. As you lie back now, let your mind drift. The storm of this story quiets into whispers, and the courtroom echoes fade into night. What remains is your breath, steady and calm, and the reminder that even the darkest stories can carry a spark, the courage of those who refuse to be silenced.